In early November 2014, the Congressional Budget Office reported that the Pentagon's base budget climbed from $384 billion in 2000 to $502 billion in fiscal 2014. The CBO also pegged the largest rate of growth to personnel costs, which increased by 46% over the 14-year period. Because of these changes, the Armed Service Committee has had to make deep cuts to the budget. While some of the changes have cut what is seen as unnecessary spending, a few of the cuts would have a big effect on soldiers' pay and housing situations. The 2015 National Defense Authorization Act that was passed in December lowered military pay raises to 1% per year, which by law is supposed to be a minimum of 1.8%. Through a presidential order, Congress was able to keep it at 1% instead of keeping pace with private market wage inflation. Housing allowances would be changed to increase only 1%, which now only covers 95% of estimated costs of service members' rent and utilities, and the department would no longer pay the cost of renters' insurance. Since fiscal year 2015, soldiers are now dealing with these cuts as Texas's average rental prices rise 0.6% over the national average. Soldiers and their families who decide to live off post must now pay more out of pocket than ever before. While those soldiers and their families who decide to live off post are having a tougher time, soldiers that live on post aren't feeling the effects as much. The inflation of rental prices could drive soldiers from renting outside Fort Hood. While the Pentagon's budget cuts are aimed at service members throughout the country, this could have an effect on the local communities around posts. If soldiers are unable to afford to live off post, they could be driven to living on post, which could affect the housing and rental markets around local areas. This story will also show different viewpoints. Not only is this going to affect soldiers and families that live on post differently than soldiers and families that live off post, but also single soldiers that live in the barracks. The first subject matter expert is retired Vice Admiral Norbert Ryan. He is the president of the Military Officers Association of America and was a big lobbyist against budget cuts that would hurt service members and their families further. The second is Matt Quinney. As the project director of Fort Hood's family housing, he understands the ins and outs of Fort Hood's housing and the BAH requirements for soldiers on Fort Hood. He also knows how much housing there is and what the influx could be for soldiers that are driven from off-post locations. The third is Senator Carl Levin. He is the chairman of the Committee of Armed Services. As the senator residing over the committee, he knows how the committee came to these cuts and understands the effects of these cuts. There are currently no stories that cover how these cuts will affect soldiers' housing situation. A majority of these stories cover a broad scope of the cuts of the Pentagon's budget, but this will be the only story that will show how these cuts will affect soldiers and soldiers that live on and off post of Fort Hood. The story will target soldiers and their families living on Fort Hood who are currently living through this situation. This story will also inform the rest of the roughly 1 million service members across the country that are also affected by the budget cuts. In conclusion, this story will focus on how the National Defense Authorization Act is affecting soldiers living on and around Fort Hood, how soldiers are paying more out of pocket to live outside of Fort Hood, while rental prices are rising higher than the national average in Texas. It will also look how soldiers that live on post are being affected and further options for soldiers who are dealing with these cuts. The fact is, while sequestering is still in effect, there could be more cuts on the horizon that could hurt service members' paychecks in the future.